You made an error, Garrett shouted, waving a stapled stack of spreadsheets like a damn torch through the bullpen. $1 million off. 1 million. This is what we're dealing with. He didn't even look at me when he said it, just threw the numbers on my desk like a verdict. Everyone's heads turned. Open floor plan, remember? No walls, no doors. Just shame echoing off ergonomic chairs and $9 succulents dying under fluorescent lights. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just looked at the top page of that mess he was waving, already knowing what it was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. He wanted the spectacle. Wanted to make an example. Fine. Let the jackal perform for his pack. But deep down, I felt something settle. Not fear. Not even rage, really. Just that low, steel-click feeling when a safety comes off. I'd been here 12 years. Long enough to know when someone lights a fuse thinking you'll be the one who burns. You ever watch someone set their own trap and forget where they put the tripwire? Quick thing before we get deeper. 97% of folks who follow these stories don't subscribe. If you like slow burn takedowns, paper trail revenge, and quiet people getting loud at the perfect moment, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And this one's worth sticking around for. Now back to Garrett. He was still pacing, pontificating about process failures and antiquated methods. I swear, he got high off the smell of his own corporate lingo. He waved at the CFO like I was roadkill they needed to sweep off the highway. This kind of sloppiness could jeopardize the merger. We're talking federal exposure. My cheeks burned. Not with embarrassment, but with restraint. I said nothing. That silence, it wasn't submission. It was preservation. Let him think I was stunned. Let him think he'd just outmaneuvered the old spreadsheet lady with her sensible shoes and thermos of black coffee. Garrett was one of those guys who thought experience meant obsolescence, not accuracy. Big mistake. He pointed again. This transaction, vendor 4,328, shows duplicate payout across 2 quarterly batches. Same amount. Same authorization. That's either incompetence or something worse. He let that last part hang like cigar smoke. Accusation without accusation. The kind HR and legal love because it's just vague enough to be dangerous. A few chuckled. The kind of laugh that says, glad it's not me. I just stared at the printout. Vendor 4,328. I remembered that file. Vividly. Not because it was wrong, but because it had Garrett's goddamn signature on the wire slip. That was 2 years ago, before we moved to the cloud. Back when I still insisted on printing everything. Old habits. I told myself. But really? I just stopped trusting people like Garrett before they even walked in the door. And now here he was, standing over me, trying to turn his own rod into my rope. CFO Dan gave me that tired, corporate wince. Let's circle up tomorrow, he muttered. We'll get clarity. Translation. We'll start building your exit file. HR will be in touch. Severance if you don't make noise. Garrett smirked as he walked off, like he'd already drafted the headline. I sat still for a few minutes after the floor went back to its keyboard clicks and Slack pings. Inhale. Exhale. Slow. Mechanical. My fingers tapped the edge of the desk once, then twice. Then I opened the bottom drawer. No one noticed. Tucked beneath a manila folder labeled Q4 Archives, pre-migration, taped flat to the bottom of the drawer like contraband, was a small brass key. Cool to the touch. Forgotten by everyone but me. And it was time. The email came in that afternoon. Subject line. Quick HR check-in tomorrow 9 a.m. Smiley face in the body. Just a formality smiling face with smiling eyes. It said, like we were gonna swap banana bread recipes. The only thing missing was the damn firing squad. I've been around long enough to know how they dress up a termination. Soft words, neutral rooms, 3 people in the meeting, just to support the process. And Garrett? Oh, he'd already laid the groundwork. I heard whispers in the break room. She's lost a step. Maybe she's just not built for the pace anymore. He hadn't just accused me of an error. He dropped a poisoned memo titled Internal Concerns Regarding Q4 Reconciliation Process. Circulated to leadership and legal before I even finished my lunch. He moved fast. I'll give him that. But this wasn't some accounting blip. This was engineered. The so-called duplicate payout he flagged? I remembered it now. Same vendor, yes, but two distinct contracts. One for logistics. One for support services. Authorized separately. Approved by Garrett back when he was still trying to play buddy-buddy with procurement. He'd just scrubbed the context and paraded the number like proof. And now I was being summoned, like a damn kid sent to the principal's office for spilling the juice box. I read that email 4 times. Not for meaning, there was none, but for the weight behind it. This wasn't about fixing a mistake. This was about removing a witness. I packed light that night. Left the thermos at home. No sense getting sentimental. I'd seen this playbook before years ago, when another exec tried to bury a bad lease agreement under someone else's initials. That time it was Doug, good guy, quiet, thorough, walked out with his dignity in a cardboard box and the company's mess glued to his name. Nobody asked questions. They never do when the fall guy doesn't shout. But I remembered. And I learned. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I laid in bed, eyes open, tracing the patterns on the ceiling while the city hummed through the cracked window. Retirement was less than 4 years away. That was the real theft here. Not just my name or my record, but the runway I'd been planning for over a decade. The pension. The matching contributions. The damn freedom I was so close to reaching. And Garrett, that smug pissant with his gelled hair and LinkedIn catchphrases, thought I'd roll over so he could patch his dirty numbers and play king of the merger. The next morning, I dressed deliberately. Not flashy, just sharp. Navy blazer I hadn't worn since the last audit committee meeting. Clean white blouse. Simple necklace. No thermos. No badge lanyard. I wanted them wondering. The HR office smelled like hand sanitizer and weak coffee. Small round table. 3 chairs. Michelle from HR. Tom from legal. And Garrett, perched like a vulture in a pressed suit he couldn't afford without the fraud. He smiled too big. Thanks for making time, he said, like I'd been summoned for a damn cupcake tasting. I nodded once. Didn't sit. Michelle gestured. This is just a touch point. Informal. Of course, I said. Voice steady. Low. Let's be informal. Garrett cleared his throat. It's come to our attention that several Q4 discrepancies appear linked to outdated processing methods. We're not placing blame, just seeking clarity. The bastard actually practiced that line. I could tell by the pause before blame. Too measured. Too careful. Tom opened a slim folder. We'd like to go over a few transaction IDs with you. I blinked slow. No flinch. No defense. Happy to, I said, already picturing the ledger. Already feeling the key in my pocket. They were coming for my name. My record. My future. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I'd kept every paper, every slip, every signature from before Garrett even had a keycard. And I was done letting people like him write the ending. After the meeting, I didn't go straight back to my desk. I needed quiet, real quiet, the kind you only find where the motion sensors forget to turn the lights on. So I slipped down the east hallway, past the empty conference rooms and budget war binders stacked like tombstones, into the little-used records subroom just off facilities. It used to be mine back when finance had filing cabinets instead of server tabs. Now it was storage for broken chairs and forgotten toner. Perfect. I pulled up the cloud ledger on my tablet. Garrett's error was right where he said it'd be. 2 identical amounts, weeks apart, both tagged to vendor 4328. But that was where the story ended. No PO reference. No digital signature trail. Just raw numbers with their context amputated. That wasn't an accident. I tapped through the audit history. Stripped. Metadata redacted like a classified CIA file. I recognized the pattern immediately. Garrett hadn't flagged a discrepancy, he'd created one. Probably routed the second payment through one of the temp shell vendors he'd been pushing procurement to approve. The kind of vendor that popped up fast, invoiced faster, then disappeared before year-end close. And the best part? He thought the move to all cloud, all digital last year had erased the paper trail. That nobody printed anything anymore. That redundancy was obsolete. I smiled just barely. You can always spot a fraud by how little they understand the value of paper. I opened the storage closet tucked behind the HVAC controls. Reached up and popped the ceiling tile. The key was still there, wrapped in blue painter's tape, pressed flat against the ductwork. I'd stashed it there 2 years ago after IT started migrating everything to encrypted cloud storage, and Garrett's predecessor started whispering about sunsetting legacy processes. Legacy, my ass. They called it old-fashioned until they needed it. I went back to my original office, the old one, before they moved me out for the new open concept zoo. Nobody had reassigned it, probably because no one else could stomach the heat when the AC went rogue. It still had the same busted blind, the same ink stain on the carpet from when the toner exploded back in 14. And in the back corner, under a plastic cover, was my safe. It wasn't high-tech. No biometrics. No flashy keypad. Just a thick, dull gray box with a keyhole, and a little dent in the corner from when it got knocked off the freight dolly years ago. Dust curled along the top like it was trying to write its own name. I knelt hands steady, slid the key in. Click. The door gave way with a low groan. Inside order. 5 manila folders, each thick, each rubber-banded and labeled by quarter. One for every fiscal period before the migration. Color-coded stickers. Ledger printouts. Arcopy guardo-ceresaschins. Notarized approvals. Vendor contact logs. And right there, Q4 3 folders deep, was Vendor 4328. 2 separate forms. 2 separate project scopes. Each with unique signatures, contract references, and routing approvals. And right there in black ink on the second authorization, Garrett's signature. Full last name, time-stamped, next to a line that read, Emergency Logistics Fund Override. Approved by VP Ops G. Miles. I stared at it for a long moment. Not with shock. Not even with triumph. Just that slow burn satisfaction of knowing you'd been right to trust your own paranoia. I stood, wiped the dust from my palms, and resealed the safe. Garrett had played his hand. Now it was time to play mine. And I wasn't bluffing. I spent the next morning moving like a woman possessed, but calm. Efficient. I don't slam drawers or storm down hallways like Garrett does. I sharpened quietly. The safe was open again by 7:05 a.m. Long before the rest of the office started mainlining espresso and pretending yesterday never happened. The air in that little office felt heavier, like even the HVAC knew something was about to shift. I pulled the Q4 stack from the bottom shelf, still crisp, even after 2 years. Each file marked by vendor number and service type. Garrett probably assumed we ditched all this when IT switched to full digital archiving. They forget I used to run this archive back when control meant more than access levels on a Slack channel. I flipped through the tabs until I found the one I needed. Vendor 4328, Logistics Ops. Inside, the original payment request, the scope document with handwritten clarifications, and the golden ticket, wire authorization signed and initialed by Garrett Miles. Not a digital signature either. Ink. Physical. Undeniable. He'd even drawn one of his stupid little check marks in the corner like a flourish. Like he was proud. I clipped the bundle together. Slid it into a plain file jacket. The kind you could drop on a table and let it thud. No gloss, no distractions, just weight. Then I took the key. Small brass, worn at the teeth. I wiped it once on the corner of my shirt and tucked it up my sleeve, flat against my forearm like a blade. I didn't bring a briefcase. I wanted him to underestimate me, to think I came empty-handed. Garrett's office was already lit up when I knocked, which was more than he deserved. He didn't even look up from his screen. Busy, he muttered. Good, I said, stepping inside. Then you'll want to hear this before you keep typing. His desk was cluttered with legal pads full of bullet points and half-baked HR phrasing. I caught a glimpse of one page before he flipped it. Exit strategy. Voluntary separation, process failure. Like a script for a corporate funeral I hadn't agreed to attend. He leaned back and gave me that crocodile smirk. Didn't expect you to come by this morning. Thought maybe you'd need time to process. I process faster than most, I said. Especially when I've seen this act before. He scoffed, leaning forward like he wanted to deliver a sermon. Look, I get it. These things aren't personal. But when there's this level of risk exposure tied to your reconciliation process, my hands are tied. The board needs assurance, and frankly, the numbers don't lie. I looked right at him. No, I said. They don't. Then I pulled the file from under my arm and laid it flat on his keyboard. His expression didn't change at first. He still thought it was a bluff. A panic move. Maybe he expected some clumsy spreadsheet printed off the cloud system. Maybe with some highlighter in desperation yellow. But then he opened it. And I watched it happen. Recognition flickered across his face when he saw his initials. His real ones. On the original, notarized wire form. Next to the scope breakdown. The payment request. The routing slip with his approval code. He didn't touch it. Just stared. You doctored this, he said quietly. I said nothing. This wasn't in the system. It predates the system, I replied. He pushed back in his chair like the file had started leaking acid. You really kept all this? Just in case, I said. He looked up at me, eyes scanning for something to latch onto. Weakness, apology, fear. He found none. You're going to regret this, he muttered. No, I said. You are. I turned and walked out, file still open on his desk, key still warm against my skin. Let him sit with it. Let him reread his own name on every page. Let him understand the cost of assuming silence meant surrender. The storm hadn't started yet. But I'd just pointed at the clouds. The meeting was scheduled like an ambush. 10 a.m., no prior agenda, invite list stacked with names that made it clear this wasn't about discussion. This was an execution. I walked into Conference C and saw the setup instantly. Michelle from HR, face politely blank. Tom from Legal, already flipping through a leather folder with post-its sticking out like little warning flags. CFO Dan was there too, arms crossed, the kind of guy who never takes a side until it's safe to do so. And at the head of the table, Garrett, smiling like he'd already won. Glad you could join us, he said. As if this was some morning strategy session and not the corporate equivalent of a firing squad. I didn't answer. I just took the empty seat, back straight, palms flat against the table. Garrett opened with a recap, his tone slick and professional, rehearsed like a TED Talk in passive-aggressive accountability. We've reviewed the Q4 financials, he began, nodding toward Dan and then to Michelle. And there are serious irregularities surrounding Vendor 4328. Specifically, a duplicated payout totaling just over $1.07 million. He clicked the remote. Spreadsheet slides projected behind him, stripped of detail but rich in implication. Same amount. Same service line. 2 separate transactions within 1 quarter. One of them has no traceable justification in our digital system. That's an issue. I didn't blink. Garrett kept going. We also discovered that the second approval lacks a corresponding cloud log authorization. It appears this was processed through outdated manual methods, outside protocol, which, as you all know, is a substantial breach of financial controls. There it was. Substantial breach. That's the trigger phrase for HR to invoke termination clauses without cause. No lawsuit, just a clean cut. He folded his hands. I'm recommending immediate administrative separation, pending final review by legal. I don't believe we can risk further delay. This puts the entire acquisition at risk. Michelle shifted in her seat. Dan looked anywhere but at me. Garrett smiled like a man who'd just served you your own obituary. I looked down at my hands. Come. Then I raised my head. Would you be open to reviewing the original records? I asked, voice low, even. Garrett tilted his head. Excuse me. The originals, I repeated. The vendor file. The wire authorizations. The printed documentation predating the cloud system. Garrett gave a short, condescending laugh. There are no originals. That system was sunset 2 years ago. Everyone turned to me. I reached into my sleeve, slow and deliberate, and slid the brass key onto the table. It hit the wood with a soft metallic click. The room went dead silent. Garrett blinked. What is that? The key to the physical ledger safe, I said. Filed by quarter, including Q4. Including Vendor 4328. Including your signature. Tom from Legal looked up. You're saying you have hard copies? I nodded once. With full authorization chains. Guide as leaps. Scope documents. All notarized, all time-stamped. All intact. Garrett's mouth opened, then shut. I could see the blood draining from his face, like his brain had finally registered that he'd built his whole plan on a digital graveyard. And I'd kept the bodies in cold storage. Michelle scribbled something on her legal pad. CFO Dan leaned forward. We'll need to see that immediately. I picked up the key, turned it once in my hand, then stood. I'll lead the way, I said. Garrett didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, blinking, as the foundation cracked beneath him. The hallway felt colder with every step, like the walls themselves had started paying attention. Nobody spoke. Behind me, CFO Dan, legal's assistant, Carla, I think, and Tom, their quiet-eyed attorney who'd built a career dissecting contracts like autopsies. Michelle from HR stayed back. Garrett followed last, silent now, probably rehearsing the spin he'd need once this thing detonated. I led them down to the east wing, past the copy room, past the windowless conference closet where budget talks went to die. We reached the door with the faded Records 1A label no one had bothered replacing since the office redesign. I unlocked it with my badge, still active for now, and stepped into the stale scent of toner dust and old carpet. In the back corner, behind a lopsided filing cabinet and an unplugged fax machine, sat the safe. It looked exactly like what it was, dull gray, industrial, and heavy with secrets no one thought mattered anymore. I knelt down, slid the key into the lock, and turned. One soft click, one slow pull, and then the door opened. Inside were 5 file jackets, rubber-banded, each marked by fiscal quarter in red Sharpie. I pulled Q4 free, flipped it open across the nearest table, and began spreading the contents like cards at a poker game no one realized had already started. First, the scope of work for Vendor 4328, printed in black ink, initialed on page 2 by Garrett Miles. Dated. Matched to a specific services contract for freight rerouting due to supply chain delays. Not some phantom invoice. This was real work tied to real deliverables. Second, the wire authorization form. Stamped. Notarized. Routing numbers filled by hand. Signature box completed with a flourish I'd seen a dozen times across Garrett's other approvals. He always looped his G, like a branding iron. Third, a matching ledger page I'd printed the day after finance processed it, before the system wipe. My initials were in the corner. That was habit. My habit. Tom leaned over the table, scanning in silence. He didn't touch anything, just read. Line by line. His face unreadable. Carla began writing, fast and mechanical, her pen tapping every few lines like it was skipping stones. Dan reached out, pulled the wire slip closer. This signature's his, he said flatly. Not a question. I nodded. On both authorizations. 2 projects. 2 contracts. 2 payments. He just removed one from the digital system to make them look like duplicates. Garrett didn't respond. I turned the page, revealing the second payment trail. Here's the logistics scope Garrett approved. Emergency fund override. This line here, it's his code. Operations VP level. Dan's expression shifted. Slight wince. A private realization that the meeting they'd just sat through, the accusations, the smugness, the breach, wasn't based on error. It was manufactured. Tom finally spoke, voice low. I'd like to retain this for compliance review. I nodded once. It's yours. Originals stay in the safe. Those are working copies. Garrett moved to speak, but the words didn't come. His mouth opened, closed. His hands clenched the edge of a chair like he could somehow keep himself tethered. I didn't look at him when I closed the safe. I didn't need to. This wasn't vengeance. Not yet. This was evidence. And for people like him, that's the sharpest blade in the drawer. Garrett sat slouched at the far end of the boardroom table. The Q4 ledger cracked open in front of him like a fresh crime scene. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even blinking. Just flipping through the pages in slow, uneven motions, like each turn hurt a little more than the last. His skin had gone the color of printer paper, somewhere between denial and collapse. Every document bore his name. Not some digital trace easily blamed on a glitch or assistant or miscommunication, but real, undeniable ink. Signatures in the same lazy angle he always used when he signed without reading. Time-stamped. Initialed. matching down to the project codes procurement had locked weeks before the payout even processed. I didn't say a word. The CEO entered late, still fiddling with his phone, clearly annoyed he'd been pulled into something urgent. But the moment he caught sight of Garrett's face, and the spread of papers on the table, he stopped cold. What the hell's going on? Tom from legal, steady as always, slid a single document toward him. Original authorizations for the Q4 vendor payments in question. Hand-signed. 2 unique scopes. No duplicación. Both approved under Garrett's override authority. Garrett jolted, like someone had just said his name for the first time. Wait. Hold on, this wasn't, there's context. There's that second payment I didn't remember signing. Garrett. The CEO's voice dropped. Low. Cold. Did you sign these? Silence. Garrett looked at me like he wanted help. Like somehow I'd rescue him from the pit he dug while trying to bury me in it. I didn't flinch. Just met his eyes and waited. No malice. Just stillness. I don't remember this version. He was scrambling now, reaching for anything, but every word made the noose tighter. It's possible someone added my signature. CFO Dan shut that down quick. They're notarized. I checked the stamps myself. 2 independent witnesses. Michelle from HR opened her laptop with the resigned sigh of someone who's done this dance before. She didn't even try to sugarcoat it. I'll start preparing the statement. Garrett's lips parted like he wanted to protest. But what was left? He'd pulled the trigger on a fraud and somehow shot himself in the face. I sat still. Back straight. Hands folded. I didn't gloat. Didn't blink. Just breathed. Because in that moment, something shifted. The silence in the room wasn't discomfort. It was gravity. The weight of power settling in a new seat. For years, I'd lived in the margins. Quiet. Useful. Invisible until needed. But right now, every eye was on me. Not because I raised my voice, but because I hadn't needed to. Vindication doesn't shout. It just stands still while the ground underneath the guilty gives out. And I knew this wasn't over. It was just the first crack. They didn't say the word fired. Not out loud, but administrative leave pending further investigation meant Garrett wouldn't be back. Not through the front door, at least. The email went out before lunchtime. Short, clinical, signed off by legal and blessed by the board. No thank you for his service. No fan farewell. Just a quiet vanishing. The kind that only happens when the risk outweighs the optics. By the end of the week, IT had disabled his badge. The intern who used to fetch him cold brew scrubbed his nameplate off the corner office door like it was gum under a desk. And me? I got a call. Not a parade. Not a meeting. Just a phone call from the CEO's assistant. We were hoping you'd stay on in an interim capacity. Help stabilize the team through the acquisition. Title would be Transitional CFO, reporting directly to Dan. We're not making anything official yet, but the board feels better knowing you're at the helm. The words felt surreal, even as I said yes. Not because I didn't believe I'd earned it, but because I'd spent so long watching people like Garrett float upward while the rest of us carried the damn weight. 12 years of clean audits, reconciled ledgers, and emergency weekends in empty offices, and still, they only noticed when it nearly cost them millions. I moved into Garrett's old office 2 days later. The view was different, wider. You could actually see daylight through the tinted glass. The desk was nicer, too. Polished oak instead of fiberboard laminate. A real chair, not one of those adjustable messes that squeaked every time you breathed. I sat down, opened the top drawer, and stared at the empty space. I reached into my bag and pulled out the spare key I'd made. Not the original. That one stayed in the ductwork where it belonged. I took a strip of masking tape and pressed the copy to the inside of the drawer. No label. No explanation. Just there. Quiet. Waiting. Because if this job taught me anything, it's that leadership doesn't always come with foresight, but survival does. And I don't believe in clean breaks. I believe in backups. The team didn't treat me like a hero. They didn't line up to thank me or apologize. But they did start asking questions again. Real ones. About vendor protocols. About approval routing. About documentation standards. The kind of questions people only ask when they realize someone's actually paying attention now. I kept the old files. Not out of paranoia. Out of principle. Garrett's name is still in there, buried beneath the line items and authorizations and fake vendors he tried to slide through. A fossil in ink. A lesson in arrogance. I didn't frame him. I didn't need to. He signed the confession years ago. All I did was keep the receipt. The boardroom was quiet. The way only money makes things quiet. Thick carpet, closed doors, voices softened by the weight of decisions worth millions. The quarterly review had started 15 minutes ago, and nobody mentioned Garrett by name. They didn't have to. His seat at the far end of the table, the one with the slightly crooked armrest and perfect sightline to the projection screen, sat empty. Still polished. Still pretending he mattered. The slides clicked forward, one after another. Metrics. Forecasts. Stabilization indicators. Nobody said the words, but I could see it in the numbers. They were steady again. Clean. Unshaken. The CEO finally paused, looked up from the printouts, and adjusted his cufflinks like he needed a second to land the moment. I want to take a minute, he said, to acknowledge the diligence and frankly the foresight that got us through this quarter intact. A few eyes drifted toward me. He didn't say my name. Maybe that was part of the strategy. Keep it subtle, keep it corporate. But he held my gaze long enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly who he meant. We were lucky, he said. Lucky someone kept the books the old way. Lucky someone still believed in hard records and backup plans when the rest of us were racing toward the cloud. The CFO, Dan, who now kept his tone about 2 notches humbler than he used to, nodded along like the words were his own. But he knew. They all knew. If I hadn't kept the paper trail, Garrett would have walked away with a clean rep, and I'd be the one boxed up and deleted. Word around the office was that clawback negotiations were underway. Legal was quietly working through the approvals Garrett had authorized, vendor payouts, falsified expense reports, even a few consultant fees that traced back to his cousin in Tallahassee. They wouldn't jail him. No, not someone like him. But they'd bleed him slow. Reputationally. Contractually. Financially. I didn't need justice. I had proof. And I had this, a new desk. A real title. Even if it had interim welded to the front, and a company that now second-guessed its shortcuts. I glanced down at the leather-bound ledger on my lap. Not a metaphor. A real one. I'd started keeping it when I moved into Garrett's office. Old habit, maybe. But it felt right. 1 entry per day. Not for tracking tasks, but moments. Details. Patterns. The things people miss when they're too busy trying to look visionary. I flipped to the final page of the quarter and jotted a note. Short, clean handwriting. Nothing flowery. Just a line to mark where this chapter ended. Then I closed the book. Some errors are digital. His mistake was thinking mine ever were.